Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Something Dark. I'm back here again tonight recording another episode for you. Just to let you know, we are on season 2 already, so each of the seasons are 10 episodes long. If you haven't listened to any of the other episodes and this is the first one you're listening to, I highly recommend going back and starting from the beginning. There are a lot of interesting cases that we've covered so far in the podcast, so definitely start from episode number 1. But anyways, that brings us to tonight's case. On the 6th of December 2009, a woman went missing in West Valley City, Utah. Her husband was named a person of interest in the investigation into her disappearance, but he was never charged. 3 years later, he killed himself and their 2 young sons in a murder-suicide. It's a case that shocked and stunned the public, and as the case unraveled, sordid details came out exposing those involved. Tonight we're going to be covering the case of Susan Powell. Susan Cox Powell was born on October 16th of 1981 in Oregon. She was known to her family and friends as being a kind and loving woman. She was an amazing mother and would do anything for her kids. Susan's husband Josh Powell was born on January 20th, 1976 in Oregon, like Susan. But unlike Susan's upbringing, Josh's childhood was a bit disturbing. Stephen Powell, Josh's dad, was extremely abusive. Josh's parents, Stephen and Tarika Powell, had a tumultuous relationship, one that ended in divorce in 1992. According to Tarika, Stephen was a harsh disciplinarian who pointedly attacked Josh. This had a profound and tragic impact on Josh, who tried to hang himself as a teen. The divorce of Stephen and Tarika Powell reads like a novel. They disagreed over everything from parenting to religion, and court documents reveal allegations of mental unfitness, pornography, polygamy, and witchcraft. Stephen accused his then-wife of adopting a new religion, which he likened to witchcraft and devil worship. Tarika argued that Steve was just addicted to pornography and would often show pornographic material to their sons. She also stated that Stephen harangued and verbally abused Josh on a daily basis. She further alleged that Stephen at times was physically abusive to his children. Tarika's sister noted that the older Power Boys had a very distorted image of their own questionable right to do anything they darn well please, combined with a very deep contempt towards women in general and any authority at all, and she placed the blame for this behaviour strictly on Stephen Powell. While most people who come from abusive and dysfunctional backgrounds never become violent towards others, the same could not be said for Josh. He once threatened his mother with a butcher knife after she asked him to do the dishes. With his father's influence, he adopted a disparaging view of women. He even killed his sister's pet gerbil. Josh, along with his 3 brothers, ended up in his father's custody, while his sister went to live with his mother. But eventually, she too went to live with Stephen. At some point, Stephen Powell's parents got custody of all 5 children. They lived with their grandparents for a year before returning to their mother. By the time they went to live with her, all of them were deeply traumatized. Despite criticizing Tarika's religious beliefs, Stephen became disillusioned with the LDS Church and began adopting extremist views. The story of Susan Cox and Josh Powell began like many others. Both were devout members of the LDS Church, otherwise known as the Mormon Church. Josh met Susan, a classmate at his LDS Church Institute of Religion course, during a dinner party at his Tacoma apartment in November 2000. The couple's relationship moved quickly, and just 6 months later, the two got married at the Portland, Oregon temple. Josh was in the midst of job hopping at the time, while Susan left her job as a cosmetologist to be a broker at Wells Fargo. Josh's goal was to become a real estate agent, so Susan got her realtor's license to answer the phones for him. She was dedicated to her new husband's budding career and what she believed would be their lifetime of love, devotion, and happiness. For a brief period following their wedding, Joshua and Susan lived at Stephen Powell's home in South Hill, Washington. Initially, unbeknownst to Susan, her father-in-law, Stephen, had developed an obsessive infatuation with her, which was only inflamed by their close proximity. Stephen followed Susan around the house with a camcorder, used a small mirror to spy on her while she used the bathroom, stole her underwear from her laundry, read her journals, and even posted love songs online under a pseudonym. The investigation into Susan Powell's disappearance revealed that Stephen had a stash of disgusting and exploitative items belonging to his daughter-in-law, including cotton balls that Susan had used to remove nail polish, pairs of her underwear in Ziploc bags, toenail clippings, hair clippings, used sanitary pads, and other horrific souvenirs, all dated with Susan's name on them. In 2003, Stephen confessed his amorous feelings to a stunned Susan, who rejected him. The encounter was inadvertently captured by Stephen's camcorder microphone. The Powells moved out of state soon after, partly so Susan could distance herself from Stephen. In 2005, the Powells welcomed a son, Charlie, and 2 years later, Braden arrived. Susan hoped the addition of their children would be the glue that kept her family together, because things had already started to sour between her and her husband. But in 2008, Josh was struggling to hold down a job, which forced him to file for bankruptcy. This only served to further erode his relationship with Susan. Susan's journal entries and email correspondence indicated the presence of marital discord. There was tension with Josh over his refusal to attend church services with his family and over his continued contact with Stephen, despite his father's ongoing advances towards Susan. Susan's friends also pointed out Josh's extravagant spending habits and to his extremely controlling behavior towards his wife. The tension between Susan and Josh went far beyond the normal marital bickering. The situation was so dire that Susan began detailing the family's struggles in journals and videotaping the family's assets in case a divorce turned into World War III. In June 2008, Susan wrote the following: "For friends and family of Susan, all except Josh Powell, I don't trust him. I've been having extreme marital stress for 3 to 4 years now. For mine and my children's safety, I feel the need to have a paper trail. He has threatened to skip the country and told me if we divorce, there will be lawyers. If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one." As Christmas 2009 approached, things inside the Powell marriage were at their lowest point, but Susan wrongly believed her husband might have been turning over a new leaf. On the morning of December 6th, Susan attended the church with Charlie and Braden, then walked home with a friend. That afternoon, neighbour Giovanna Owings stopped by the Powell home to visit with Susan. Susan asked her to come over to help her untangle some yarn she was using to crochet a blanket for Charlie. Pancakes and eggs were on the menu for dinner that evening, and Josh was the chef. Josh said that Giovanna could stay for dinner, but her kids couldn't come because he didn't have enough food. As the two women untangled the knotted web of yarn, the boys helped Josh in the kitchen. An artificial, half-decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner of the Powell's living room, and Susan was waiting on Josh to get the rest of the ornaments down from a high shelf in the garage. There were already presents for the kids under the tree. While Josh was backing further and further away from the church, Susan was spending more and more of her time there. She had put money aside for tithing, a requirement to enter temple, against Josh's wishes. Susan explained to Giovanna that she and Josh had started going to marriage counselling through the church, but Josh had stopped attending the sessions and wasn't reading a marriage book that had been assigned to them as homework. It was rare that Susan had the opportunity to vent to her friends about her marriage, and Giovanna was nervous about having a conversation with Josh there. She told the Salt Lake Tribune, "I didn't want to go into it that night, because I felt like this should be a private conversation where I could talk to her and not have him butt in." He had a tendency to butt in. At some point during Giovanna's visit, Susan remarked that she was cold. Josh stopped what he was doing and brought her a blanket. Giovanna was impressed by the sweet gesture. Perhaps he wasn't as bad as she had heard, especially since he was making dinner and actively involving the kids in the process. When the meal was ready, Josh brought a plate to Giovanna and his wife, and then sat down at the kitchen table to eat with the boys. Giovanna said, "It was nice because the last time I was there, he had to dominate the conversation. He had to be the center of everything. When he came into the room, it was all about Josh, what Josh had to say. This time it wasn't like that, and I thought, That's really nice. At around 5 p.m, Susan decided to go for a nap. Giovanna assumed Susan was just worn out after a recent miscarriage and an ear infection she'd been battling. Giovanna stayed until about 5:30 p.m. untangling the yarn. When Josh told Charlie and Braden to get ready to go sledding, Giovanna saw herself out. Another neighbour spotted Josh return with the boys at around 8:30 p.m. 3 hours later, Mark Basidas, another neighbour who lived one house away from the Powells, was locking up his car when he heard an alarm sounding inside the closed garage at the Powell home. Oddly, the house was dark, and when the alarm continued to sound, Marco's sister suggested he alert the neighbours. But it was getting late, and Marco didn't want to bother anyone. Eventually, the alarm shut off. Meanwhile, yet another neighbour may have been tipped off that something was amiss at the Powell home. She heard a man and a woman arguing, and would later tell police she regretted not getting up and looking out the window to see where the angry voices were coming from. When the Powell's garage door was opened and the family's blue minivan emerged later that night, no one saw or heard a thing. It was approximately 12:30 a.m. when Josh Powell said he loaded his boys into the minivan and took them camping at Simpson Springs campground, some 25 miles west of Vernon, in a remote desert. Susan, he said, remained at home, asleep. It was snowing and the area experienced sub-zero temperatures that night. A co-worker of Stephen Powell's would later reveal that Stephen had told her that he accompanied the Powell boys on the trip that night, where they sat around a campfire, roasted marshmallows, and threw snowballs. The conversation between Stephen Powell and his colleague would shed more light on what happened to Susan as time went by. Between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. on December 10th, the Powell's daycare provider grew concerned that something was wrong with the family when the couple failed to drop off Charlie and Braden on schedule. Stranger yet, the daycare provider couldn't reach Josh nor Susan at home or on their mobile phones. The daycare provider contacted Josh's mother and sister, who immediately became alarmed and contacted the police. Police arrived at the Powell home and broke in, but nobody was home. Ominously, however, they discovered 2 large fans blowing on a wet spot of the carpet. Upon further searching, investigators found traces of blood on the floor, life insurance policies on Susan for $1.5 million, and a handwritten letter from Susan expressing fear for her life. DNA test results, later released in 2013, matched one of the blood samples with Susan, while another sample was determined to have come from an unknown male contributor. Police interviewed the couple's eldest son, Charlie, who confirmed that the camping trip Joshua described took place. However, unlike his father, he stated that Susan had gone with them, and she did not return. Weeks after her disappearance, a teacher reported that Charlie had claimed that his mother was dead. Furthermore, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, explained that while at daycare several months after the disappearance, Braden drew a picture of a van with 3 people in it and told carers that Mommy was in the trunk. That evening after Susan's disappearance, when Josh finally answered his phone, he was informed by concerned friends and neighbours that police were waiting for him at his house. When he arrived home, he was immediately taken to the West Valley Police Station for questioning. He gave them his nonsensical story about the spontaneous camping trip in dangerous winter weather. He seemed nervous. Police visited Simpson Springs on December 10th, but found no evidence of the campsite that Josh had described. They also found it suspicious that Josh would take out young boys camping after midnight when he was scheduled to go to work at his job just hours later. Josh hadn't told his boss that he wouldn't be coming into work that day, and explained to police it was because he thought it was a Sunday rather than a Monday. So, where was Susan? If she'd gotten out of bed and decided to leave, she left the house unprepared. The West Valley Police found Susan's purse, phone, and other items in the house that she would most likely have taken with her. On December 10th, Josh, Charlie, and Braden, along with 100 other neighbours and friends, gathered at Westview Park for a candlelight vigil. They handed out flyers and prayed for Susan's safe return, and Josh shed a few crocodile tears for the cameras. Years later, in August 2012, West Valley Police released documents showing that Josh took actions that were regarded as highly suspicious following Susan's disappearance. Josh liquidated Susan's retirement accounts, cancelled her regularly scheduled chiropractic sessions, and withdrew his children from daycare. He had also previously spoken to co-workers about how to hide a body in an abandoned mineshaft in the western Utah desert. As the investigation into Susan's disappearance unfolded, Susan's family held press conferences, and an anonymous donor offered a $10,000 reward. Josh's rental car was searched by police, and they found that he had driven the vehicle several hundred miles. The family's minivan, along with the home, was searched multiple times. In late December, Josh lawyered up and stopped cooperating with the police, leading those involved to infer that he wasn't interested in his wife being found. Police obtained a subpoena for all of Josh's media interviews due to his odd behavior. They wanted to see what clues they could glean from his demeanor and tone of voice, which were undoubtedly apathetic and suspicious. Anyone who thought Josh might be a grieving husband changed their mind when in January 2010, just 1 month after Susan's disappearance, Josh packed up his and the boys' belongings in preparation to move back to Washington State. Just when it seemed like Susan's case had gone cold, a judge issued a warrant allowing investigators to search Josh's Washington home, where Josh was living with his kids and his father, Stephen. The warrant came 1 day after Susan Powell's disgusting ABC News interview, in which he claimed he'd had a sexual relationship with Susan prior to her disappearance. One of the biggest threats to Josh Powell's freedom was his own sons. Josh had hoped that they would either keep their mouths shut or that they would be too young to remember or understand what happened to their mom. Josh had told police that Susan stayed home in bed that night and didn't go on the camping trip, but Charlie didn't back up his dad's story. When interviewed, Charlie told investigators that he went camping at Dinosaur National Park and that his mom, dad, and little brother were with him. He said that the family took flowers and crystals with them, but when it was time to come home, Charlie explained, Mom stayed where the crystals are. When confronted with his son's testimony, Josh told the police, "She wasn't with us. They know that's not true." Charlie and Braden were removed from Josh's custody in 2011 and placed in the care of Susan's parents. Josh was only allowed supervised visits. A judge ordered that the boys remain with Chuck and Judy until Josh underwent a psychosexual evaluation and took a polygraph test. While in the care of Chuck and Judy, the boys became increasingly vocal about what happened on that night of the bizarre camping trip. Susan's parents' lawyer, Steve Downing, said they were beginning to verbalize more. The oldest boy talked about that night they went camping, and said that Mommy was in the trunk. Mom got out of the car, Dad got out of the car, and Mom disappeared. Charlie made a drawing showing him and his brother in the family minivan, with Josh at the wheel, and when asked where Mommy was, Charlie would say, "In the trunk." He added that Mommy and Daddy got out of the minivan, and Mommy didn't come back. Anne Bremner, an attorney for the Coxes, explained that the boys only began to feel safe enough to share what happened that night during the camping trip, after they went to go live with their grandparents. Though the boys were too young to fully explain what happened that night, each time one of them spoke, a clearer picture emerged. She said in 2012, "I know that to be true in this case because as recently as Christmas, the boys told their grandparents, 'Mommy's in the mine. If we go to the mine, we'll find Mommy.'" Investigator scrutiny extended to Stephen upon learning from a family friend that he had been obsessed with his son's wife. Computer images seized from his house in 2010 turned up 4,500 images of Susan taken without her knowledge, including close-ups of specific body parts. Police also turned their attention to Michael, Josh's brother, after learning that he had sold his broken-down Ford Taurus into a wrecking yard in Pendleton, Oregon, shortly after Susan's disappearance, and later ordered satellite images of the lot. When the police found the car, a sniffer dog indicated that a decomposing human body had been in the trunk, but DNA tests on the car proved inconclusive. On September 14, 2011, Utah authorities discovered a possible grave site while searching Topaz Mountain, a desert area near to a campsite that Josh had gone to frequently. There were signs of recent soil disturbance and shoveling, but after digging a few feet down, police were unable to find any remains in spite of careful sifting of the soil. Police continued to examine the site for a time, but offered no explanation as to why they had previously announced the finding of remains when none had actually been confirmed. Authorities said they were following a scent detected by their sniffer dogs. Relations between and within the Powell and Cox families became increasingly hostile. After a police raid in their home in 2011, both Josh and Stephen spoke to major news outlets regarding journals that Susan had allegedly written about the relationship between herself and Stephen. Stephen claimed that he and Susan had been falling in love prior to her disappearance, and he cited the content of the journals, written when Susan was a teenager, as evidence to support his theory that she was mentally unstable and could have run away with another man. A judge issued a permanent injunction forbidding Josh and Stephen from publishing any material from Susan's journals, ordering the pair to either return or destroy any journals already published. On September 22nd, Stephen was arrested on charges of voyeurism and child pornography after police found evidence that he had secretly videotaped numerous women and young girls, including Susan. John Long, Assistant Attorney General for Washington State, said that Joshua was a subject in the child pornography investigation. Chuck Cox filed for custody of Susan's children the day after Stephen was arrested. A Washington court eventually granted Cox temporary custody of the boys, ruling that Joshua would have to move out of Stephen's home if he ever wanted to regain custody. Josh rented a house in South Hill, but authorities later alleged that he had never actually moved into that house, merely making it appear as if he had satisfied the court's instructions while continuing to reside at Stephen's home. In late September 2011, Josh's sister Jennifer stated that she believed Josh was responsible for Susan's disappearance. His other sister, Alina, had also been suspicious of him as well. However, she later withdrew her suspicions and felt that Josh had been unduly harassed by the investigation. By this time, West Valley City had spent more than $500,000 on the case. On September 28th, Mayor Mike Winder indicated that he felt the case was not worth the expense, stating, "We feel like we're getting to the tipping point where we have more hot evidence than we have had in the past 2 years, and that the case was moving forward." In late 2011, Josh underwent a series of court-ordered evaluations in Washington. The evaluations, by James Manley, determined that Josh had adequate parenting skills, a steady employment history, and no criminal record or history of domestic violence. However, Manley also raised issues concerning the ongoing criminal investigations, Joshua's failure to admit normal personal shortcomings, his overbearing behavior with his sons, and his persistent defensiveness and paranoia. The initial recommendation for Josh was to have visitation with his sons several times a week, supervised by a social worker. In the last week of January 2012, Utah police discovered 400 images of simulated child pornography, bestiality, and incest on a computer seized from the Powell family home. These images had been cached when viewed by the previous owner of the computer, which had been purchased by Susan secondhand. However, Utah authorities misled the court and accused Josh of having viewed the images. The images, while not illegal due to them being hand-drawn or, in cartoonish 3D format, were cause for great concern to Manley, particularly given Josh's earlier denial of possessing any such material. Josh was recommended to receive a more thorough psychosexual evaluation and polygraph test, but Manley suggested no change in the visitation schedule with the Powell boys. On the 5th of February 2012, this case took an even darker turn. 911 received a call from a social worker, Elizabeth Griffin Hall, who had taken Charlie and Braden to a supervised visit at Josh's house in South Hill. That morning, the boys told their grandparents they didn't want to go and see their dad. They wanted to stay at home. Their grandmother reassured the boys that everything would be okay and that their dad had something fun planned for them to do and they would have a great time. The social worker picked up the boys like normal and drove them the 10 minutes over to Josh's house. The social worker, who was supposed to monitor the visit between Josh and the boys, reported that the boys ran to Josh in excitement, but Josh grabbed the boys. He gave the social worker a weird look and slammed the door in her face and locked it. The social worker knocked on the door and shouted to let her in. She heard Josh say, "Charlie, I have a big surprise for you," and then heard Braden crying and screaming. It was later discovered at this point that Josh was attacking his sons with a hatchet. The social worker began to smell gasoline. Worried, she called 911. Unable to remember the exact address, she went back to her car to get the information for the dispatcher.
Something really weird has happened. The kids went into the house and the parent will not let me in the door. What should I do?
The call lasts 7 minutes. The operator asking her name, the color of her car, ignoring her urgency.
But I think I need help right away. And this is the craziest thing. He looked right at me and closed the door. Are you there? I smell gasoline and he won't let me in.
In a by-the-book approach, she's told officers can't respond immediately.
Ma'am, they have to respond to emergency, life-threatening situations first.
Well, this could be life-threatening. I'm afraid for their lives.
We know now inside a crazed father is butchering his children and setting off an inferno, 10 gallons of gasoline.
He blew up the house and the kids. He didn't ever leave the house. He just opened the door. The kids were one step ahead of me. They're 5 and 7. They were one step ahead of me, and he slammed the door in my face.
Soon after, the house exploded, killing Josh and the 2 children. Local authorities treated the case as a double murder-suicide, saying that the act appeared to have been deliberate. When authorities notified Stephen, who was in jail at the time, he didn't seem very upset by the news, but was angry towards authorities who notified him. 2 weeks later, Stephen invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to answer questions regarding Susan's disappearance. Cox and others stated they believe Stephen knows exactly what happened to Susan. Stephen was convicted of voyeurism charges in May 2012, in a trial which had already skirted the issue of Susan's case. After a relatively brief investigation, officials confirmed that the explosion had been deliberately planned. The official cause of death for Joshua and the 2 boys was determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning, though the coroner also noted both children had significant chopping injuries on the head and neck. A hatchet was recovered near Josh's body, and investigators believed that he attacked the boys with it before becoming overwhelmed by smoke and fumes. The fire investigation also found 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline on the premises, as well as evidence that gasoline had been spread throughout the house. Friends and relatives of Josh told authorities that he had contacted them by email minutes before the accident to say goodbye. Some of them, including his pastor, received instructions for finding his money and shutting off his utilities. Records also showed that Josh had withdrawn $7,000 from his bank account and had donated his children's toys and books to local charities the day before the incident. Josh named his brother, Michael, as the main benefactor of his life insurance policy. Charles and Braden were buried at Woodbine Cemetery, which also contains a memorial for their mother. Josh's remains were cremated. On February 11, 2013, approximately 1 year after the death of Josh and his sons, Michael took his own life in Minnesota, where he had moved for graduate school. He jumped from the roof of a parking garage. Police had questioned Michael several times in 2012 after discovering his abandoned Ford at the Oregon Wrecking Yard. Michael was evasive about why he left his car at that location, and Utah authorities have since said they believe that Josh and Michael were accomplices in the murder of Susan. In a February 2013 interview, Manley, who had conducted the 2011 to 2012 evaluations of Josh for Washington state authorities, acknowledged his suspicions that Josh was involved in his own wife's disappearance. However, he did not mention these suspicions in his report because they were beyond the scope of his duties and because Josh had not been charged with any wrongdoing. On May 21, 2013, West Valley City Police announced they had closed the active investigation into Susan's disappearance. In March 2015, Chuck Cox won a protracted court battle with Tarika and Alina Powell over control of Susan's estate. Tarika and Helena had sought to have Susan declared legally dead to collect life insurance, but Cox ultimately gained full control of the estate. The Cox family also sued Washington State's Department of Social Health and Services, claiming that the agency prioritized Josh's parental rights over the safety of the boys and facilitated their deaths. While a lower court initially ruled against the Coxes, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit reversed this ruling and allowed the case to proceed to trial in January of 2019. Susan's family also pressured state lawmakers in Washington and Utah to pass bills that would restrict or block visitation rights for parents being investigated for murder. Susan Powell was released from prison on July 11, 2017, after serving a total of 7 years, following his voyeurism and child pornography convictions. He died of natural causes in Tacoma, Washington, on July 23, 2018. Chuck and Judy Cox have spent the last 8 years in agony while trying to find some semblance of justice. In 2020, when it finally seemed like they were on the verge of finding some closure, the COVID pandemic hit and everything was brought to a halt. I don't know anything else I could have done, and they're all still dead. My daughter's still missing, and now the children are dead, said Chuck Cox. I had them safe. They were in my care. Why take the kids? Why? It makes absolutely no sense, said Chuck. Chuck says the legal battle is not about the money. He said, it's all about making a change in the DSHS, where they actually care about the safety of children and doing their jobs the way they should. The money, unfortunately, is the only thing we have. We can't force the DSHS to do anything, but the governor can. The supervisors can. And all of these people need to change their attitude and rededicate themselves to the safety of children. And I believe these are basically good people, but they've been left on their own, unsupervised, and not held accountable for their actions. We have been robbed of 3 precious lives, and it's just devastating to think the same person did it. Susan remains a missing person, but given the fate of her sons, it is widely believed that she was murdered by her husband. And that brings us to the end of tonight's episode. So I want to hear what all of you think about this case, what you think happened. For me, I think that night Josh and Susan maybe got into an argument and he killed her. He cleaned up the crime scene in the house, washed the carpet, put her in the trunk of the car, in the boot of the car, told his kids they were going camping, and dumped her body in the mine. That's what I feel like happened. I don't know the extent of if Stephen and Michael were involved. It obviously seems like they were. The scene at the house with the 2 large fans drying the piece of carpet that the blood was found on is pretty damning that something happened at the house. And then the kids, like, obviously they were very young at the time, but they're still able to vocalize, whatever happened, and that mom came with them but didn't come home. I hope you found the 911 call interesting. The quality of those calls usually isn't great, but I hope you're able to hear it clearly enough. I've listened to lots of different podcast episodes on this topic, and that part of the case always gets to me. It's just so horrifying. Saying that, she pulled up and the kids didn't even want to go that day, but whenever they got there, they were excited to see their dad. They jumped out of the car, and her not even thinking, she let them run ahead, like 1 or 2 steps ahead of her. He grabbed them, looked at her and gave her a weird look and slammed the door. And then she heard him saying, "Charlie, I have a surprise for you." And then butchered the 2 kids. It's so creepy. I get he had like a traumatizing childhood, but a lot of people go through that and they don't commit this these kinds of crimes. So in the future, moving forward, I hope that Susan's body could be discovered to give some kind of closure to the Cox family. I'm sure they would love to have her, to lay her to rest with her sons, because currently at the minute they just have a memorial in the same cemetery as the sons. So like I said, if you have any insight on this case, I would love to hear it. If you want to find out more about the case, there are a lot of different documentaries that are out there. There's also a book that you could read if you want to learn a bit more about the case. If you have any recommendations for upcoming cases, please let me know. You can get in contact with me by Instagram. That's the best way to reach me. It's just something.dark.podcast on Instagram, but I'll leave it in the show notes. So with that brings us to the end of the episode. I want to say a big thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next week.